I want to start this video with what I think is an extraordinary statistic, but also one that's scarcely believable. So in the 1950s, just 70 years ago, there was over 20,000 Irish people in asylums across the 26 counties of the Republic of Ireland at the time. That meant that over 1% of the entire adult population were institutionalised in these asylums. It was the highest rate of anywhere in the world. Now, to explore this history, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Brendan Kelly. Brendan is an expert on this area. He's a professor both in UCD and Trinity College in Dublin, and he's published extensively on this. I've links to some of his books beneath this video. But to start exploring this topic, me and Brendan went right back to the early 19th century to look at how people with mental health problems were treated before asylums were built. They would only be built, as we'll talk about later on, in the early to mid 19th century. But before that, a lot of times it was the families of people with mental health problems that had to look after them. And as Brendan is going to explain to you now, some of the ways in which people were treated with mental health problems in the early 19th century was really appalling.
So families either rejected the person and they literally wandered the roads of the country, or sometimes families detained the person and locked them up. So, in the Commission of Inquiry in 1817, there is some very vivid evidence from Mayo, which was no different to any other county, I hasten to add, of a person with what we would call mental illness being kept prisoner, essentially, in a pit in the ground in the cabin with a grid over it to prevent the person coming out, and there they would live, they would be fed, and most likely there they would die.
Now, it might be hard to believe that families would treat their own siblings, sons, daughters in this way, but the government really didn't have any solution or any way to treat people with mental health problems before the early 19th century. Brendan explains kind of the government attitude here.
There was no systematic provision for people who might have been considered to be mentally ill, using whatever language was used at the time. So the authorities really didn't concern themselves hugely unless there was apparent law breaking. And this is what led to the development of, to use the language of the times, lunatic sections in prisons, because so many people with what we would now call mental illness ended up in prison for minor offences like vagrancy.
Now, some of these attitudes would begin to change in the early to mid 19th century, and this is where the asylum came into play. So it was believed at the time that basically institutions could solve any problem in society, and this led to the construction of a network of asylums right across Ireland. In the second quarter of the 19th century, a lot of these began to pop up, and these would quickly become massively overcrowded. Now, interestingly, the Great Famine does play a role in this. Brendan explains now the impact the famine had on the mental health of the generation who were born during that crisis, because you'll hear how many of these people will present with mental health problems later in the 19th century. Then after this, we're going to go on and talk about what life inside these asylums was like. But first, Brendan here details the impact of the famine.
The famine came in an era when rates of institutionalization in psychiatric hospitals were increasing rapidly. They certainly continued to increase during the famine. And we know from studies elsewhere that babies who were in utero or born during or shortly after these kinds of hugely physiologically stressful events tend to have increased rates of mental illness in later life. So when you look at the Irish numbers, look at the statistics for admissions to asylums, which are influenced by lots of different factors. But when you look about 20 years after the famine, which is the high risk age, around the age of 20, for conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, we do find an increase in first admissions of young adults with what we might now call schizophrenia and bipolar disorder about 20 years after the famine. These are people who were, in utero. They were developing during the famine, and they were born either during or shortly after the famine.
Now, by the later 19th century, this network of asylums across Ireland were massively overcrowded. There was thousands and thousands of people already in these institutions. And Brendan now explains what life was like in them, because it was, I suppose in a word, degrading for a lot of the people who found themselves in these asylums.
There were these massive institutions that were expanded beyond all imagining, desperately overcrowded, deeply unhygienic. I mean, up to 12% of patients in them died each year from infectious diseases that were fueled in these large, unhygienic, impossible institutions.
Mental health at this time wasn't particularly well understood, and myself and Brandon talked at length about some of the treatments that people received in these asylums. In hindsight, they were, in a word, appalling. Lots of them were dangerous, even led to death. Before we get into these individual treatments, Brendan explains kind of some of the background to this approach of some of the treatments people would be offered, because you will be stunned by some of the treatments we go on to talk about, because they had almost no impact or a negative impact on the patients.
So those first decades of the 20th century saw the asylum doctors start what can only be called a desperate series of treatments, which, to our eyes and our ears today are almost impossible to imagine.
Now, next we went on to talk about some of the treatment, and I think we'll start with one that did work actually. So late stage syphilis was a major problem up until the early 20th century, and it affected the brain. So many people would end up in asylums if they were suffering from late stage syphilis. But there was a treatment given to patients with this condition that actually worked. Now, Brendan is going to explain to you what that treatment was, but pretty incredibly, we still don't understand why it worked, but it did work. Then after that, we're going to go on and talk about things like lobotomies, which were the darker end of these treatments.
This was a treatment for advanced syphilis affecting the brain, which was a huge problem in the asylums. This was before antibiotics for syphilis. And the treatment was to give people malaria, treat the malaria with quinine, and that this reduced the effects of the syphilis affecting their brain. Now, this treatment, incredibly, seems to have helped many people. It's an extraordinary thing, and we will never understand why, because syphilis is now very treatable and we don't see this late stage any longer.
So while that did work, there was lots of other treatments that inflicted terrible pain and suffering on the patients that had no impact at all. Like Brendan talks here about a treatment for schizophrenia that was used at the time that didn't help but did take a toll on patients.
Insulin coma therapy. Now, this was a therapy that involved giving people, mainly people with schizophrenia, what we would now call schizophrenia, insulin. So putting them in a short coma twice a week for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then getting them out of the coma again using glucose. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that this treatment worked, and many people died. Everyone who got this treatment, they gained weight. It's not possible to regulate someone's insulin and glucose with that level of precision that often. So people gained weight, and there was a high morbidity. And that treatment didn't last for very long in Ireland, although it went on longer elsewhere.
Now, of all the treatments that patients in these asylums were subjected to, I think the lobotomy is the one that maybe survives most in the popular consciousness. I suppose it features maybe a bit in films and things like that. But Brendan talks now what a lobotomy was. It's really, I suppose, poignant and sad listening to him talk about this and how it had such an awful impact on the people who had to, I suppose, endure this treatment, might be a word to describe it.
Another treatment was lobotomy or leucotomy. So this is a surgery on the front part of the brain, and it was used for patients who were long-term in institutions mainly and had very disturbed behavior. This was undoubtedly the single greatest mistake in the history of these treatments, and many, many people suffered and died as a result of it. It was, when you read the story of lobotomy, it was fueled by really good intentions, where you had asylum doctors and their asylums, their mental hospitals were full of people they couldn't discharge. So a kind of a therapeutic desperation kicked in.
Now, I think when we hear histories like this, stories of terrible mistreatment of people, there's a natural tendency to look for blame and look at who is responsible for this. I think that's a very natural thing to do. And in this part of our history, though, the answer to that is very, very complicated. So as Brendan and myself talked more about this, he addressed the fact that these asylums were what he describes as social institutions. That means their purpose or role in society wasn't just one of treating people with mental health problems, but they actually were very important to local economies. So in many parts of rural Ireland, if you had an asylum in your area, that would mean jobs over generations, there would be building contracts, Shops would supply the asylums with food, things like that. So you can imagine how they become really important. And this led to a situation where many communities, rather than say protest against what was happening in asylums, would welcome them into their communities. Brendan talks about one specific asylum here, but it gives you a sense of how I think there's a complicated part of our history when it comes to addressing the role of asylums in Ireland, and I guess who's responsible, because the reality is many of our ancestors would have benefited from these asylums, whether it was by supplying them with food, from shops, or whether it was working in them. And I think this is a complicated part of our history, but maybe explains why we don't address it in a more direct way.
When you look at the town of Ballinasloe again, and the size of the town, about 5,500 people in the town, and then the size of the hospital, which was almost 2,000 patients. So, any local representative who argued for scaling down or shutting down an economic powerhouse like that would get absolutely nowhere, because generations of people worked in them and they were very steady jobs.
Now, what you've heard in this video is only a small part of a much longer conversation I had with Dr. Brendan Kelly. I have a link to the full podcast episode beneath this video where we explore a lot of these topics in much greater detail. I have to say I found it one of the most, maybe challenging is the right word, but I found it one of the most challenging interviews I've done in quite a while, because Brendan really kind of, gives that perspective of how it's not as easy to blame when it comes to this history. And, blame isn't necessarily a great way to react when it comes to history. I think in terms of understanding, it doesn't necessarily always help. But if we want to kind of go, who was responsible, maybe that's a better way of saying it, it's not that easy, because lots of our ancestors, as I've explained and as Brendan explained, played a role in these institutions and would have welcomed them into their communities. If you want to find out more anyway, there's the link to that podcast below. I also have links to Brendan's books as well. So finally, I will say thanks very much to Brendan for his time. It was a really fascinating conversation. And thanks to you for tuning in. If you have got to this point in the video, do subscribe to the channel. I produce videos on Irish history every week, and there's already a great back catalogue of videos there that looks at the history of the Great Hunger in the 1840s. So do check them out and subscribe to the channel. I'll be talking to you soon.